Episode 14. Did Christopher Columbus have a positive effect on world history? An AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Hey everyone, I'm Miles, and today we're doing something a little different. In the last couple of episodes, we've talked about the conquest of the Americas and the Columbian Exchange, what actually happened after 1492. But today, we're stepping back and asking a bigger question. How should we interpret all of that? Was Columbus's impact on world history ultimately positive or negative? And I'll be honest, this feels like a big question. Also, quick life update. I've got my last cross-country meet in about a week, so I'm kind of nervous for conference, but also ready to be done with the season. Before we jump in, can I ask something? We've done a few of these episodes now. What exactly is historiography?
Good question. Historiography is the study of how history is written and interpreted. It's not just about the past. It's about how historians explain the past.
And that includes the debates between historians. When two historians look at the same events but come to different conclusions, that's historiography in action.
So it's like history about history?
That's a useful way to think about it. You're analyzing interpretations, not just events.
And it matters because every historian brings a perspective, shaped by their time period, their values, and the questions they think are important.
So history changes?
Yes and no. The facts themselves, who did what, when it happened, those don't change. But the meaning we make out of those facts can change a lot. And that's because the most important question in history is usually, why? Why did people act the way they did? And that's harder to answer, because we can't climb inside someone else's mind. So historians interpret the evidence, and those interpretations are where the debates come from.
Those interpretations can change, but the underlying facts don't. The events themselves, who went where, what happened, those stay the same. What changes is how historians explain and evaluate those facts.
Right. Think of it this way. The past is fixed, but our understanding of it isn't. As new questions are asked or new perspectives are included, historians may reinterpret the same evidence in different ways.
Okay, that helps. So today isn't just about Columbus, it's about how historians interpret Columbus.
Exactly. That sounds like a familiar feeling, Miles. Anticipation mixed with relief. And in some ways, that's not a bad mindset for today's topic. We're dealing with something complex, where there isn't a clean, simple answer.
Exactly. And that's really the point of a historiography episode. We're not just asking what happened. We're asking how historians make sense of what happened.
So let's start there. What does it even mean to say Columbus had a positive effect on world history?
That's the right place to begin. When historians ask that question, they're usually thinking about long-term consequences. Not just Columbus's voyages themselves, but what those voyages set in motion. Global trade, empires, cultural exchange, and also exploitation and inequality.
And it also depends on perspective. Positive for whom? Europeans? Indigenous peoples? The global economy? Human culture? Those answers don't always line up.
So this isn't just a history question. It's kind of a values question, too.
Precisely. What you consider positive depends on what you think matters most.
Okay, so let's get into the first side of the argument. What do historians who see Columbus as having a positive impact actually say?
The historian Robert Royal represents that position. His main argument is that Columbus's voyages marked the beginning of a truly interconnected world. Before 1492, different parts of the globe existed largely in isolation from one another. After Columbus, those barriers begin to break down.
So he's basically saying this is the start of globalization?
Exactly. The creation of a global system, economically, politically, and geographically. Trade networks expand across the Atlantic. New goods, crops, and resources begin to circulate. Over time, this leads to the development of the Atlantic economy. Royal even argues that this is one of the first moments when people begin to see the world as a single connected system rather than separate regions.
And from a cultural perspective, this contact forces societies to confront difference in new ways. Europeans encounter entirely new peoples, religions, and ways of life. That creates tension, but it also sparks new forms of thinking.
Like what?
Ideas about human difference, morality, and rights. For example, Figures like Bartolomé de las Casas begin to argue that indigenous peoples should be treated as fully human, with rights and dignity. And thinkers like Francisco de Vitoria start developing ideas about natural law. Basically, early arguments that all humans have certain rights, regardless of culture or religion.
And from a systems perspective, that's significant. Some historians argue that European expansion eventually leads to the development of ideas like natural rights and international law.
Wait, so the argument is that even though there was violence and exploitation, it eventually leads to things like human rights.
That's the claim. Royal acknowledges that there were serious harms, violence, disease, exploitation, but he argues that the long-term result is the creation of a global system that allows for shared knowledge, exchange, and eventually more universal moral frameworks. He even points out that debates about how Europeans should treat indigenous peoples led to formal discussions in Spain about morality and empire, which was unusual for the time.
That kind of sounds like saying the ends justify the means.
That's one of the key tensions. Supporters of this view would say it's not about justifying the harm, but about recognizing that the consequences are complex and not entirely negative.
They also emphasize context. Europe in the 15th century was dealing with major crises: plague, political fragmentation, and pressure from the Ottoman Empire after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Exploration emerges out of that instability as Europeans look for new routes and opportunities.
So Columbus isn't just some random guy setting out for adventure. He's part of a bigger historical moment.
Exactly, and his motives were mixed: religion, ambition, profit, curiosity, not purely one thing.
So how do historians weigh that? Like, how do you compare long-term benefits with immediate suffering?
That's the central challenge, and it's why there's no simple answer.
All right, so what about the other side? What do historians who see Columbus's impact as negative argue?
The writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez presents a very different interpretation. He focuses on the perspective of indigenous societies and the long-term consequences of conquest and colonization.
What does that argument look like?
First, he challenges the idea that the Americas were somehow empty or undeveloped. He emphasizes that indigenous civilizations, like the Aztec and Inca, were complex, sophisticated societies with large populations, organized governments, and advanced knowledge systems, including mathematics, astronomy, and architecture.
From a structural perspective, he also highlights what comes after Columbus: systems of forced labor, extraction of wealth, and the creation of racial hierarchies.
Like the casta system?
Exactly, a system that categorizes people based on race and ancestry, creating long-term inequality.
Marquez also emphasizes motivation. He portrays Columbus and the Europeans as driven largely by the search for gold and wealth. He even describes how Columbus becomes fixated on gold almost immediately after contact, suggesting that this desire shapes everything that follows, including exploitation and violence.
And then there's disease too, right?
Yes, the demographic impact is massive. Indigenous populations decline dramatically due to disease, violence, and forced labor. In some regions, populations fall by millions within a relatively short period, completely reshaping societies.
And for Marquez, the key point is that these effects are not temporary. They shape the modern world: economic inequality, political instability, and ongoing struggles over identity and culture. He points to things like racial hierarchies, discrimination, and social divisions that persist long after the colonial period ends.
So he's saying this isn't just something that happened in the past. It's still affecting people today.
Exactly. The legacy of colonization is ongoing.
Is he blaming Columbus for all of that?
That's another key question. Some historians argue that Columbus initiates the process, even if he's not personally responsible for everything that follows.
So it's like he starts something that grows way beyond him.
That's one way to think about it.
So how do historians decide how much responsibility to assign to one person versus a whole system?
They debate it, which is exactly what we're seeing here.
All right, so let's put these side by side. What are the biggest differences between these two interpretations?
One major difference is how they evaluate globalization. Royal sees it as a process of connection and exchange that eventually benefits humanity. Marquez sees it as a process of domination and exploitation that creates lasting inequalities.
Another difference is how they view indigenous societies. Royal acknowledges complexity but doesn't center it. Marquez places it at the center and emphasizes the destruction of those societies.
There's also the question of outcomes. Royal focuses on long-term developments, global systems, shared knowledge. Marquez focuses on long-term inequality and structural harm.
So they're both talking about long-term effects, but they're focusing on different ones.
Exactly.
Can both of these be true at the same time?
Many historians would say yes. History is often about holding multiple truths at once.
The world did become more interconnected, and that interconnected world includes both opportunity and inequality.
So this isn't really about facts, it's about how you interpret the same facts.
That's exactly right.
So how do historians end up with such different interpretations of the same events?
One key reason is perspective. Historians are shaped by their own time period, values, and experiences. That influences what questions they ask and what they see as important. For example, earlier historians often focused on European achievements, while more recent historians are more likely to focus on the experiences of indigenous peoples and the consequences of empire.
Earlier historians often wrote from a more Eurocentric perspective. They emphasized exploration, achievement, and expansion. More recent historians tend to include a wider range of voices, especially indigenous perspectives.
So the story changes depending on who's telling it.
Exactly. As new voices are included, the interpretation evolves.
And that's something historians are very aware of. The same set of events can be interpreted in very different ways depending on the framework you use.
So studying history isn't just about learning what happened, it's about learning how people interpret what happened.
That's a very good way to put it.
And Columbus is a perfect example. He can be seen as a symbol of exploration and connection, or as a symbol of conquest and inequality.
Or both at the same time.
Exactly.
All right, let's wrap this up. Today we looked at a major historiographical debate, whether Columbus had a positive effect on world history. We saw two very different interpretations, one emphasizing global connection and long-term development, and the other emphasizing destruction, inequality, and lasting consequences. And the big takeaway is that history isn't just about what happened, it's about how we interpret what happened, and those interpretations are shaped by perspective and context. Next episode, we'll move into the 17th century and explore why historians sometimes call it an age of crisis, even as powerful new states began to emerge. Thanks for listening to The Once and Future Present, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions.